Okay, this week's video is going to be a bit gnarlier than usual. If you have any issues with excessive gore and dismemberment, as well as anything regarding excessive whispering and any kind of audio-visual hallucinations, then feel free to bow out and come back next week. And because of the aforementioned gore and dismemberment, I have a good feeling that this video is going to get age-restricted and not be as widely available. So, for this one, feel free to not only do the usual leaving of the like, but also share it around if you'd be so kind. They'll be deeply appreciated and would get more eyeballs on this video. Now that we got that out of the way, it's time to talk about a decent remake of my favorite horror game ever. Dead Space takes place in the year 2508, where humanity has taken to the stars following the depletion of Earth's resources, and has devised the brilliant idea of mining other planets' resources in the buck-wild process called planet cracking. You step into the boots of the Engineer Issac Clarke, who's part of a small repair crew sent to fix a communications blackout on the USG Ishimura, the flagship of Earth's deep space mining operations. Once you get there via rough landing, you notice, alongside the security chief Hammond and the computer tech Daniels, that shit is wrong almost immediately because the ship is seemingly abandoned and half of its systems are in the red. And then they get attacked by a bunch of weird fucked up monsters. After the initial attack, what follows is a trip across 12 chapters of space-based horror against God knows what, and Isaac doing all of this to get in touch with his girlfriend Nicole, who was a doctor on the ship. Let's just get the big thing out of the way first and foremost. The biggest change to Dead Space that the remake adds is that it lets Isaac talk. I'm kind of thrown through a loop on this one, at least at first. Isaac was a silent protagonist in the original Dead Space, mainly because, at least for my headcanon, he was way too scared and traumatized to focus on speaking. But here, he talks, he converses with other characters, and he's primarily the one coming up with the solutions to the various engineering problems on the ship. And that last one makes a weird amount of sense because in the original Dead Space, he had Hammond and Daniels, the respective security chief and computer tech, coming up with the fixes, and that felt weird as hell. And Isaac's newfound ability to communicate also allows for more survivors to be found on the ship, and for Isaac to talk to them. The key example of this is when you go through the hydroponics deck and find out that one of the horticulturists is still alive and came up with an idea to deal with a Leviathan that's poisoning the ship's air quality. Another one that immediately stepped out to me was the expansion the story in the remake does for Dr. Chalice Mercer. Dr. Mercer in the original was a straight-up religious zealot who was using the outbreak as an excuse to experiment on humans just to see what would happen from what I remember. In the remake, he's not only fully aware of his own actions, but he's also far more sadistic and dangerous. He actively fucks with your progress is the vehicle by which the remake really goes all in for reminding people that Unitology is basically an apocalypse cult, and even introduces concepts like convergence, which last I checked wasn't even mentioned in the main games until at least late into Dead Space 2. He's willingly an evil bastard in the remake, and that manages to make him a bigger monster than most of the monsters you fight. He fills the role that Hans Tiedemann in Dead Space 2 and Jacob Arthur Danik in Dead Space 3 had in the form of a human heavy that moves forward the plot when the Necromorph threat can't. And then there's the stuff with the Hunter, which was a whole-ass actual guy named Brand Harris, who was a willing test subject for Mercer's experiments because of a mix of social isolation and trauma, on top of being manipulated into it, was conscious for the procedure, and is still somewhat aware of being a Necromorph. There's even a side quest that gives you his backstory, and it's actually kind of heartbreaking. These and other changes to the narrative make for a different and incredibly interesting take on the source material, but it doesn't change the basic narrative. The events of Dead Space are relatively the same, but the way we reach those events is different. I'm a huge fan of this because, again, it's a new take on familiar material. And while I do like a lot of the narrative changes, there are some changes to the structure and gameplay that I'm not as big on, even if I like some of them. was a third-person horror shooter originally developed by EA Redwood Shores before they were called Visceral Games. Rest in peace, you magnificent bastards. A huge part of the appeal was that Glenn Schofield, the creator of the Dead Space series and founder of Striking Distance Studios of the Callisto Protocol fame, I should play that one of these days, wanted to make a horror game that was as terrifying as possible. So he and his team took inspirations from Event Horizon and the 1972 Soviet film adaptation of Stanislaw Lem's Solaris and Resident Evil 4. The team clearly had good taste. They did that by recreating Resident Evil 4's control scheme and feel one-to-one and added free movement. That one change in the aggressive nature of the enemies made it so that body and headshots in the conventional sense would be difficult to land, so it led to this really cool wrinkle of strategic dismemberment, as the developer back in the day called it. What that meant is that the only way to keep the Necromorphs, the undead creatures that plagued the Ishimura's halls, from getting back up was to cut them to pieces. Now, you're probably asking how we could do that considering the ample amounts of bone blades and other body horror weapons, and I say, calm down and I'll tell you. The main thrust was through the arsenal. With the exception of the pulse rifle, which is an actual firearm, all of the weapons in Dead Space are repurposed mining tools. The main thing to keep in mind is that most of the weapons in the original Dead Space kinda fucking sucked. Like, really fucking sucked. The only way that arsenal could have sucked harder is if one of the weapons was an industrial-strength vacuum cleaner. Okay, I'll stop being mean. I'm being serious. With the exceptions of the plasma cutter and the Ripper, which was a remote-controlled circular saw, none of the weapons in the original Dead Space were worth using. The main change on a combat front was that they've all been buffed considerably to promote weapon diversity and diversity of playstyle. I love that a lot of the weapons are at least usable now. The force gun and the flamethrower actually do damage now, whereas before they just were the most useless weapons in the game. And the worst gun is still the pulse rifle, and it's not even half bad. It operates more like the pulse rifle in the later Dead Space games, where the alternate fire is actually a built-in grenade launcher as opposed to a weird crowd-controlling sprinkler thing. But the pulse rifle in later games benefited from there being necromorphs that could die from sustained body shot damage. No such case here though, so I use it mainly to soften enemies up. But I still find myself using mainly the plasma cutter and the Ripper because I like precisely cutting off limbs, and they give me that option. However, I at least gave the other weapons a spin, because one thing that stuck out to me is that the remake gives you way less ammo to work with. This is a lot in the early hours because it takes 4 shots from a plasma cutter to cut off a slasher's limb on normal, and when you have unupgraded weapons, that is a problem. But it's a problem in service of scaring the shit out of you, so I like it. The Necromorphs all feel like they're bulkier to compensate for the increased power of the arsenal, and I feel like that's a fine change because it feels fair enough. The different types of Necromorph all give cool variations to the core gameplay loop of run, stop, shoot, like Resident Evil 4 did, through different enemy types. My favorite is the aforementioned Hunter I mentioned earlier. He shows up in chapters 5 and 10, and his shtick was originally Necromorph that could grow back limbs. And while it still fits that role, it feels more like Nemesis in Resident Evil 3, where he relentlessly stalks you throughout the area you're in. Lastly, they also added the wrinkle of the Kinesis module being able to grab sharp objects and use them to impale enemies to walls with them, like in Dead Space 2. It's even tutorialized to you in the same way. It was so goddamn cool. All in all, I like the combat changes because at the end of the day, I'm still lobbing off alien limbs, and it's a tense old time. The changes to the USG Ishimura itself and the more open-ended nature of the exploration, on the other hand, I'm more mixed on. The main 12-chapter structure is still there, but it was changed to be more seamless and flowing. This is in stark contrast to the original structure of each chapter being self-contained onto the part of the ship that they were set on. Not a problem in theory. In practice, it's coupled with several major alterations to the level design. It weirdly feels like it's changed for the sake of change, because the original level design, while linear, was still open enough for some off-the-beaten-path exploration. It led to finding credits and other replenishable items. All of the new changes make it feel way easier to get lost, and this is wild because there's a guide button that keeps you from getting lost. The new security clearance system is another change that I'm also against. Originally, in order to get past security doors, you had to choose between either leaving it for the next playthrough or New Game Plus, or spending one of your precious power nodes. This was a nice piece of friction because you can only get so many of the damn things and you can't upgrade everything. You were constantly making choices in your head on how to spend your resources, and that was great. Now it's just wait until you get far enough in the story to get clearance and come back later, and it has me going, yeah, that feels way less interesting. It's not all doom and gloom, however. I love the fact that they backported zero-gravity exploration from the later games into the remake. Instead of just awkwardly jumping to a specific spot, you can just fly there and it opens up the zero-G areas on the Ishimura so much. I also like the inclusion of side quests. Yes, you heard me, side quests. They also add a lot to the overall narrative by giving extra story and context, and showing how fucked the actual situation on the ship really was. So at least that's good. Oh, and circuit breakers. There are these new things called circuit breakers where you need to allocate power to different tracks. Like, for example, powering a door while also either turning off the lights or turning off life support. These are all over the ship and are a fantastic way of introducing some sadistic choices for how you want to proceed. I also want to talk about the way this looks and sounds. The higher fidelity of today's systems makes the Dead Space Remake's rendition of both the USG Ishimura and the Necromorphs look stunning. The lighting is done so well that the darkness makes it legitimately hard to see on my main monitor unless I have my flashlight open on my weapons. So much so that I had to check the footage to make sure it wasn't too dark for the rest of you to see. And the Necromorphs all look suitably gross, and they benefit from a new mesh layering technology to boot. So, EA Motive, the developer of the Dead Space Remake, thought it was a good idea to add layers to Necromorphs in the form of skeletal bones, then muscle mass, then skin, and each of these gets shorn off as you damage them. And in the case of the Hunter, you see all of these grow back in real time, and yes, it's as nasty as it sounds. It's a neat impromptu health bar to see how much they have left before dying, which is a neat wrinkle. Isac's rig continues to be the best damn example of diegetic UI in video games, with the health bar and stasis modules on his back, showing in a clean and non-intrusive manner, and the rest of the game's in-game menus and readable items being holograms coming out of his helmet. The inventory is a little annoying to navigate because Isaac still moves in-game and has to use the arrow keys on PC to navigate it, but it's not the end of the world. And the sound design is still top-notch, with the chittering of the Necromorphs instead of the vents making me paranoid as heck. I love it. It's so good. The Dead Space Remake is a good remake of my favorite horror game, but if I had to choose, I'd say go with the original version. Not because the remake is bad, but because while I love all of the combat changes, the exploration isn't as interesting to me in the remake, and that was a huge part of making the ship feel like a character. If you can find a 360 copy, go with that because the original PC version has a nasty memory leak issue, and that makes it almost unplayable. And in the more than likely event that you can't find one, this'll do in a pinch. The changes to combat and narrative are more than enough to make up for it, and I dare say, are good enough to justify the existence of the remake in the same way that the Resident Evil remakes do. Because they're basically different games at that point, and the original is still there. If you're looking for a good spooky time and space, this is just what the doctor ordered. Give this a chance, and I promise you won't regret it. Stay tuned for next week, where we close out Spooktober with the final video. Altman be praised, safe tidings, and Halloween!